The Doom of the Haunted Opera by John Bellairs and Brad Strickland, Chapter 3. Clutching the sheet music to his chest with his left hand, holding the flashlight in his right, Louis scrambled out of the orchestra pit and fled toward the dim archway at the back of the auditorium. His running footsteps echoed, and he thought he heard the ghost right behind him. He was almost to the door when something grabbed his coat and yanked him backward. He screeched in terror. "Hey!" yelled Rosarita. "Cut it out, Louis. It's only me." Louis almost collapsed with relief. He wouldn't say in the auditorium, so the two of them went out into the vestibule, where Louis stood next to one of the dirty windows, as if ready to leap out. Then, still panting for breath, he tried to tell Rosarita what he had seen and heard. She gave him a doubtful look. "A ghost?" she asked. "Are you sure?" Louis nodded. "He looked horrible," he said, "all gray and stiff. And he was skinny as a board." Rosarita sighed. "Louis, you know what an imagination you have." Louis glared at her. "I didn't imagine it," he insisted. "I saw him and I heard him. For Pete's sake, Rosarita, you've seen some pretty strange things too." Louis knew he had a good point, since he had become friends with Rosarita. Rosarita had witnessed some amazing magical events, both benign and terrifying. Now she looked a little uncertain. "That's true," admitted Rosarita with obvious reluctance. "But all of that happened at, spooky times and in spooky places, not in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, right in the center of New Zebedee." "You think this isn't a spooky place?" asked Louis. "It's big and dark and empty, and anything could be in there." "I didn't see anything scary," said Rosarita, "just the old dressing rooms, and half of them are stuffed with junk from the seed and feed and boxes and mounds and boxes of mounds and almond joys from the five and dime. I guess Mr. Pfeiffer uses the back rooms as a warehouse or something. What do you have there?" Louis was still gripping the musical score tightly against his chest. He held it out and said, "I found this hidden inside the piano." "Hidden, huh?" Rosarita took the stack of dried-up paper and carefully looked through it. "Seems to be all handwritten. There's music and lyrics and everything. Say, do you know who would love to see this?" "Who?" asked Louis. "Miss White." Miss White was the music teacher at the junior high school. She was always organizing recitals and performances, and she was always trying to interest her students in fine music. Miss White didn't have much use for the kind of music most young people listened to. She called it bebop and jitterbugging. With a sniff, she would say, "Truly educated people have better taste than jitterbugs." Louis looked at the music doubtfully. "I don't know," he said slowly. "That's what I was holding when I saw the ghost. Maybe they're connected." "Okay," responded Rosarita. She held the sheaf of papers out to him. "Here you are. Just take this back and leave it where you found it. I'll wait here and we'll just forget that you ever looked inside the piano." If looks could kill, Louis's glower would have wiped out half of New Zebedee. "Not me. If you want to hang on to that, it's yours. I'm not going back in there. At least not as long as the electricity's off and there's no light." Louis had added the last part because he really hated being a coward, and Rosarita was right about his overactive imagination. He read voraciously, and everything he read lived on very strongly in his imagination. Other kids might be afraid of movie monsters or of spooky radio shows like Lights Out, but Louis populated his own nightmares with terrifying figures like Professor Moriarty, the insidious Dr. Fu Manchu, the evil Mr. Hyde, and other characters from his books. For a few minutes, the two friends stood quietly while Louis got his breath back. Then, after Rosarita had carefully locked the door, they went downstairs and gave the flashlights and key back to Mr. Pfeiffer, who was dozing in his chair near the stove while his friends droned on and on to each other about the weather. Once outside, Louis said, "Where to now?" "Let's go see Grandpa Galway," replied Rosarita. "He can tell us when the opera house was built, and maybe he even knows something about your ghost." Louis didn't like the idea very much. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I don't mind talking about stuff like that with Uncle Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman, because they understand apparitions and all, but your grandfather might think I'm loony." "Okay," Rosarita said. "We won't tell him about the ghost. Maybe there's another way to find out something about him. Anyway, let's get moving, or I'm going to turn into an icicle." It was after 5, and the day was getting even colder. They walked down Main Street toward the fountain, which the city fathers turned off when the temperature dropped below freezing. The marble columns surrounding it looked as if they had been carved from blocks of polar ice. Rosrita took the lead, turning left onto Sycamore Street near the drugstore. Rosrita's grandfather lived at number 122 in a small one-story cottage. Mr. Galway liked to tinker and build things, and his front yard was crowded with a fish pond, frozen over now, a stone terrace with lawn furniture, and a bench swing hanging from a wooden frame. Louis had visited here before, and he knew that the backyard was even more cluttered with about a dozen odd little hand-carved windmills that did crazy things. One was a wooden juggler who tossed 4 balls in an endless circle. A little old man frantically tried to chop the head off a turkey, but the gobbler always yanked his neck back just in time. A sailing ship swung this way and that in the wind, while the miniature crew frantically moved their arms as if hauling on ropes. Louis thought the commotion was exciting and fascinating, although Mr. Galway's neighbors had been known to complain that it was all a nuisance. Rosrita jumped up to the low front porch, with Louis right behind her. There was an antiquated twist-type doorknob in the shape of a dog's head with a bone in its mouth. When you grabbed the bone and turned the whole head, the bell made a growling sound. After a few moments, Mr. Galway opened the door. He was a tall man with a bald head and bright blue eyes that glittered from behind rimless spectacles. "Well, well," he said genially. "My favorite granddaughter, and the Sherlock Holmes expert. Got any crooks lately, Louis?" "Nope," said Louis with a grin. One of the things Louis liked most about Mr. Galway was that in his younger days the old man had attended a lecture on spiritualism by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and after the lecture he had shaken hands with the famous author. Louis had shaken hands with Mr. Galway, so it was always like he himself had touched the writer of the Sherlock Holmes tales. Come in, and don't stand around here freezing to death," Mr. Galway said. They went into his living room, which was toasty, and Rosrita's glasses immediately fogged up. She took them off and polished them with a handkerchief from her coat pocket. The room was crowded but comfortable, with dozens of framed photographs on the wall, a large overstuffed armchair, a long sofa decorated with a Navajo blanket, a magazine rack full of Popular Mechanics and the Saturday Evening Post, and lots of knickknacks. Louis sniffed. The warm air was heavy with delicious aromas of roast beef and cherry pie. Mr. Galway had been a cook in the Navy, and so he prepared all his own meals. "Sit down, you two," said Mr. Galway. "Let me see about a couple of things in the kitchen, and I'll be right out." As Louis had anticipated, when Mr. Galway returned, he brought back what he called a little snack. It consisted of hot roast beef sandwiches, tall glasses of milk, and a slice of fresh cherry pie for each of them. They all dug in as Rosrita told her grandfather what she and Louis were doing for their history project. She asked him to tell them about the old theater. Mused Mr. Galway. "I remember all right. Must have been back in about 1900. It was after I worked on the Civil War Memorial anyway. At first, all that space over the seed and feed was just empty. It was supposed to be a warehouse or something, but it wasn't well designed for that. Too much trouble to get farm supplies up and downstairs, for one thing. Well, anyway, the New Zebedee, Ela Monastery, and Cultural League. Ellemossary, Ellemossynary and Cultural League decided there ought to be an auditorium somewhere in town, and they leased the space from old Mr. Pfeiffer, the father of the fellow that runs the store today. They hired me to design the theater, and I did. Took about 2 years to build, and she opened in May of 1902. Gilbert and Sullivan's Pirates of Penzance. I remember I took my wife, my first wife, Coral, rest her soul, not your grandmother, Rosrita, to the performance." "When did the theater close?" Rosrita asked. Mr. Galway sniffed. "It was after the First World War, I suppose. It was about 1919. I'm afraid it was never a big success, though it had its moments. Caruso once gave a concert there, you know, and I remember a great evening when the magician and escape artist Harry Houdini did some amazing things, but most of the time the performances were pretty poorly attended. Then, too, there was the big influenza epidemic right after the war, and that may have had something to do with it. Of course, that isn't what everyone in town will tell you. They'll say it was because of old Emanuel Vanderhelm and his bad luck. Louis glanced at Rosrita. Emanuel Vanderhelm was the name on the cover of the sheet music he had found inside the piano. Who was he? Louis asked. Famous man in his time, said Mr. Galway. Or at least that's what I was to understand. They said he had sung in operas all over the world, Germany, Italy, England, everywhere, and he came to New Zebedee to settle down and retire. But you know how it is. He was like an old fire horse, I guess. Always ready to run when he heard a bell. What do you mean? Rosrita asked as she finished the last bite of her pie. The old man smiled. I mean, he was always ready to sing or play music or get involved with opera again. Anyway, he wrote a... Excuse me. Anyway, he wrote a show especially for the theater, picked out people to be in it and all, rehearsed it and was supposed to put it on. Then the bad luck started. Rosrita leaned forward. What sort of bad luck do you mean? Well, various problems. His soprano broke her leg and had to be replaced. Then the building where they were making the sets caught fire and burned to the ground. Then the manager of the theater up and disappeared. On top of that, half the people in town were sick with the flu. Then the most mysterious thing of all happened. Opening night came and Mr. Vanderhelm just didn't show. Left them in the lurch. I hear tell he might have taken all the box office money with him, too. Anyway, he never returned. All the people in town were so disgusted that they not only canceled the show, they just locked up the theater, and even though the league had taken out a 99-year lease on the space... Mr. Galway pushed himself out of his chair and collected all the dirty dishes on a tray. Now that I think about it, I might be able to dig up something else about that old theater, he said. You swabs do these dishes for me, and I'll see what I can find. They went into the kitchen, where Rosrita washed the dishes and Louis dried and put them away. By the time they finished and returned to the living room, Mr. Galway had brought a worn, leather-bound family album from his bedroom. He sat on the sofa as he leafed through it, with Louis on one side and Rosrita on the other. There were hundreds of photos inside, most of them faded to a brownish tint. Many were places he had visited while he was in the Navy, Singapore, London, Honolulu, and other exotic ports. Then he stopped and said, Here it is. This was taken on the opening day of the theater back in 1902. Louis looked. The photo showed about a dozen people standing in the vestibule of the theater, and in the picture, everything looked fresh and new. A big poster on the wall behind the group showed a funny-looking man in a pirate costume, and in ornate letters the caption read, Gilbert and Sullivan's The Pirates of Penzance. Mr. Galway turned to the page. Got several of those, because I was so proud of the job I did with that theater. Here's me and Harry Houdini, and here's what I'll be darned. He had stopped at a picture that showed a younger Mr. Galway with a full head of dark hair and a big mustache standing in front of the stairs outside the Seton feed. The building looked about the same, except for a large sign over the stair doorway that proclaimed, The New Zebedee Opera House. Mr. Galway stared at the picture and scratched his head. Well, I'll be. Guess my memory is playing tricks. I could have sworn that Emanuel Vanderhelm was in this picture with me, but I'm all by myself. He flipped back to the Pirates of Penzance photo. Anyway, this is my first wife, Coral, he said. Louis suddenly leaned forward. He put his finger on the man in the front row. Who is this? He asked. That tall drink of water, said Mr. Galway with a grin. That's old Mordecai Finster, the theater manager. He's the one who skipped town later on just before Vanderheim's show flopped. Louis felt sick. He did not think Mordecai Finster had skipped town. Something worse had happened to him. The man in the photo was tall and thin, with deep-set eyes and bushy mutton-chop whiskers. Louis had seen that figure before. It was the ghost in the orchestra pit. And that's the end of Chapter 3.